You have 24 hours. Then you're out on the street. My daughter-in-law said that just 3 weeks after my son left this world. Not a tremble in her voice, not a second of hesitation, just a cold announcement that she had received $12 million, and the apple orchard our family had cared for 40 years now belonged to her. To her and a man named Jackson. I was standing in the late-season orchard when I heard it, pruning shears still in my hand. The trees were nearly bare, the air thin and quiet. I couldn't understand it, how a family could be erased from its own home with a single phone call. Before I tell you what happened after that call, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Sometimes, just knowing there's someone out there, someone willing to listen, is enough to help a man like me keep speaking the truth. And then, I didn't answer her right away. I ended the call, stood still in the orchard. The last apples of the season swayed quietly on their branches. Autumn in Vermont isn't loud, but it's cold enough to wake a man up. I walked back toward the wooden house that had stood there for 40 years. Every step on that porch, I built with my own hands. Every window frame. Dana had wiped so many times the paint had thinned. I told myself maybe Hazel was panicking. Maybe it was grief talking. Maybe the funeral had broken something inside her. I was wrong. The farm gate was wide open. A strange SUV sat close to the porch. The front door stood open, and our clothes, mine and Dana's, were scattered across the wet grass. Hazel stood in the yard, light-colored coat, hair pulled tight, phone pressed to her ear like she was closing a business deal. She did not look like a woman who had just lost her husband. Beside her stood a tall man in a black jacket, hands in his pockets. I had seen him before. Hazel once introduced him as a distant cousin. Today, she didn't use that word. Jackson is moving in next week, she said when she saw me. Her voice was flat, calm, like she was announcing a renovation schedule. You should pack quickly. I changed the smart lock system. The old code doesn't work anymore. I looked up at Grant's bedroom window. The curtains were still half drawn. 3 weeks ago, I stood there, watching the ambulance pull away. Dana stepped out behind me. She didn't speak. She just looked at her sweaters lying in the mud, then bent down and picked them up one by one, brushing them off gently, as if she were trying to save the last bit of dignity we had left. Hazel walked closer and held out a stack of papers. I finalized the beneficiary transfer. The life insurance and the trust are both in my name. Grant updated everything before what happened. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The farm will be listed soon. I don't plan to stay in Vermont forever. I took the papers, didn't read them. I just looked at her. It's only been 3 weeks, I said. She didn't answer. Jackson stepped half a pace forward. His eyes were cold, measuring. He didn't say a word, but I understood my place. Dana walked inside. I heard her soft breath when she saw the living room. The family photos were gone from the walls, some of them face down on the table. Then she called my name. I stepped into the kitchen and saw Grant's framed photo in the trash bin. Not broken, just placed there, like something no longer useful. Dana's hands trembled when she lifted it out. She didn't cry out loud. The silence was heavier than that. I turned to Hazel. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, she said. I need to clear out the past if I'm going to start over. That was the moment I understood. To her, Grant was a chapter to close, not a man to remember. I set the papers down. We'll be gone before dark, I said. Dana looked at me, surprised. But she didn't argue. Hazel gave a small nod, like a deal had just been finalized. We didn't take much. A few suitcases, and a small wooden box with Grant's personal things from his office. I don't know why I grabbed it. Maybe because it was the only thing she hadn't touched yet. When I pulled the last suitcase off the porch, rain began to fall. Not heavy, just enough to soften the ground beneath our feet. Dana stopped at the oldest apple tree, the one Grant used to climb as a boy. She placed her hand on the rough bark, like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. Hazel stood on the porch, arms folded. You can send me your new address, she said, in case there are legal documents. I looked at her one last time that day. I won't be sending anything, I said. Jackson closed the door before I turned away. We got into my old pickup truck. I didn't turn on the radio, didn't speak. I just drove down that dirt road, the one I had known for half my life. In the rearview mirror, the house lights came on. Same house, but no longer ours. Dana sat beside me, her hands resting on Grant's wooden box. "Todd," she said softly, "when did she change?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about the nights Grant came home late, saying Hazel was working on her own projects, the whispered phone calls he took outside, the times he said, "I'm fine, Dad. Don't worry." I believed my son was grown enough, wise enough, to see clearly the woman beside him. Maybe I was wrong. We stopped in a small-town parking lot nearly an hour away. I had no real plan, just knew that night we had no home to return to. The sky grew darker. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Dana leaned her head back and closed her eyes. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. I placed my hand on the wooden box. Inside it was what little remained of Grant in that house, and I began to wonder. My son was careful, a lawyer who read every line twice. Did he really sign everything Hazel claimed he did, or was there something I still hadn't seen? The first night in the pickup truck, I didn't sleep. Rain tapped softly against the roof, steady as a clock counting down. Dana lay on her side, her coat pulled over her shoulders. Her breathing wasn't as steady as it used to be. I listened to every breath in the dark, and for the first time in many years, I didn't have an answer. The next morning, I drove to a small pharmacy in town. Dana needed her heart medication. She'd been taking it regularly for years. I handed over my supplemental insurance card. The pharmacist stared at her screen longer than usual. Then she frowned. "Sir, the system shows the benefits were canceled last week." I stood there for a few seconds. "Are you sure there isn't a mistake?" She shook her head. The change request came from the primary legal representative. I didn't need to ask who that was. I tried to pay with my credit card. Declined. I tried again. Still declined. A different kind of cold moved through me. Not from the weather. Hazel didn't just want us off the farm. She wanted every door behind us sealed shut. I counted the cash left in my wallet. Not much. Enough for a few days. When I returned to the truck, Dana was sitting upright. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Just a system glitch," I said. I didn't want her carrying everything at once. But I knew we couldn't stretch this for long. We moved into an old van. I used to haul apples to market years ago. It was parked behind a farm equipment repair shop. The owner used to buy fruit from me. He didn't ask many questions. Just said we could park there for a few days. The van was colder at night than I expected. Dana started coughing. She said it was nothing, just autumn air. But I saw her hands shake when she held her cup of water. I wasn't angry the way people imagine. It felt more like everything solid in my life was slowly shrinking. On the third afternoon, while Dana slept, I opened Grant's wooden box. Inside were a few notebooks, a fountain pen, and a small silver USB drive. I remembered seeing it in his desk drawer once. Never asked about it. I plugged it into the old laptop I kept in the van. There was only one folder. Its name was "If Something Feels Wrong." I didn't know why he chose that name. My son was careful. He never spoke unless he was sure. Inside were 3 audio recordings and 1 draft document. I opened the first recording. Grant's voice filled the van. Calm, measured, the same way he used to talk to me. If Dad is listening to this, it means things didn't go the way I hoped. I paused. My hand rested on the keyboard. Grant said that over the past 2 years, he noticed unusual financial transactions, changes to insurance documents he didn't directly request, conversations. Hazel pushed him to sign quickly. "I don't have solid proof yet," his voice continued, "but something feels off. I've started preparing a backup plan." I opened the draft document. It was an addendum to the trust, not publicly filed. I didn't understand every legal word, but I understood the spirit of it. Grant didn't fully trust what was happening around him. I sat in that van for over an hour, not thinking about money, not thinking about property. Thinking about this, my son saw something, and he didn't tell me. Dana woke up near dusk. "Todd," she said softly, "I don't think Hazel did this just for money." I looked at her. She looked scared, Dana continued. In her eyes that day, it wasn't only greed, it was worry. I didn't know if Dana was right, but I remembered Hazel's face when I said we'd leave before dark. That wasn't the face of someone celebrating a victory. It was the face of someone who wanted everything over, fast. That night I called one of Grant's old colleagues. They had worked at the same law firm. I didn't explain much. I asked one question. Did Grant ever say he finalized a change to his insurance beneficiary? There was silence on the other end. Todd, he said slowly. Grant asked me about the procedure, but he told me he hadn't signed anything yet. He wanted to review it again. A small crack formed in the picture Hazel had painted. If Grant hadn't completed the change, then who did? I didn't tell Dana that part yet. I sat outside the van watching the distant town lights. Some people think losing your home makes you panic. It didn't do that to me. It made me calculate. I thought about the brake system in Grant's car. After the accident, the police said it was likely slick roads and mechanical failure. I accepted that explanation. I didn't have the strength to question more. But now, as other pieces slowly surfaced, I began to wonder. Had something been overlooked, I didn't want to believe the darkest version of the story. I didn't want to turn grief into something else. But I couldn't close my eyes either. The USB drive rested on the seat beside me. Grant had prepared. And if my son prepared, then he understood more than I ever realized. The next morning I said to Dana, "We're not finished." She looked at me, didn't ask another question. I started the engine. This time, I wasn't driving without direction. I turned the truck toward Burlington. Grant's old colleague agreed to meet at his small office. No large sign out front, just a modest brass plaque beside the door. I didn't walk in like a man trying to reclaim property. I walked in like a father trying to understand what had been hidden. He had already reviewed the draft from the USB before I arrived. When I sat down, he slid a folder across the desk. There was a beneficiary change filed, he said. The date was 1 week before the incident. I looked at the date. I remembered that week clearly. Grant had dinner with us that Sunday night. He said he was tired, but there was nothing about him that suggested he was about to rearrange his entire financial plan. The signature, I asked. He exhaled softly. It appears valid, but there's something unusual. The electronic filing came from a different device than the one Grant typically used. The IP address doesn't match. I'm not a lawyer, but I understand what unusual means. Maybe he used another computer, I said, though I didn't fully believe it myself. Maybe he replied, "But there's more." Grant emailed me saying he wanted to delay any changes until he completed additional internal reviews. I remembered the first recording. Grant saying he didn't have clear proof yet, but something felt wrong. We printed the entire history of changes to the insurance and the trust. Small edits over the past 2 years, nothing dramatic on its own, but enough to form a pattern. Most of the confirmations were signed by Hazel, as spouse. I left the office close to noon. Dana was waiting in the truck, her hands resting on Grant's wooden box. "Anything new?" she asked. "Piece by piece," I said. That afternoon, I received another call, not from Hazel. A man introduced himself as a private investigator. He said he was tracking someone named Jackson Reed, suspected in several financial fraud cases in another state. He asked if I knew whether this man was currently in Vermont. I looked at Dana before answering. "I do," I said slowly. The investigator didn't share everything, only that Jackson had appeared in multiple files as a distant relative or business partner of women who had recently received large sums of money. Soon after, the money disappeared, and so did Jackson. I ended the call and sat quietly for a few minutes. Dana didn't press. She just said, "So, it wasn't random." I thought about Hazel standing in the yard, that tension in her eyes. If Jackson was who the investigator described, then Hazel might be standing inside a game bigger than she realized. But what unsettled me most was still Grant's car. I pulled out the mechanical report the police had sent us. Back then, I only skimmed it. Now I read every line. There was a small note at the bottom. Brake system shows signs of uneven wear. However, wet road conditions may have been the primary factor. I'm not a mechanic by trade, but I've worked with machinery my whole life. Uneven wear doesn't always happen by accident. I called an old acquaintance who used to work at a repair shop in the next town. "Can it be re-examined?" I asked. He hesitated. "The vehicle's been stored since the initial investigation, but if there's a new legal request, it could be reviewed." I didn't say I suspected anything specific. I only said I no longer believed in coincidence. Over the next few days, the pieces began fitting together in ways I didn't like. The investigator sent me a copy of an old warrant tied to Jackson in a southern state. Not violence, financial fraud and identity falsification. The file noted a pattern he targeted through romantic relationships. Over the past 2 years, Hazel had taken frequent real estate consulting trips that Grant never joined. I remembered those trips. The times she said she needed space. One evening after Dana fell asleep, I opened the second audio file on the USB. This time, it wasn't Grant speaking. It was Hazel's voice, not in direct conversation with Grant. It was a phone exchange Grant had recorded. "We just need to be patient a little longer," Hazel said in the recording. "Everything will belong to me. After that, no one can stop us." A male voice answered. Low, quiet. I didn't need to hear the whole thing to know it was Jackson. I stopped the recording halfway through. I didn't want to hear more that night. I sat in the darkness of the van, thinking about the contingency clause Grant had drafted. It wasn't just precaution. It was a signal. Grant saw the risk, and he tried to build an exit Hazel didn't know about. If the beneficiary change had been filed fraudulently, then the entire legal ground Hazel was standing on could collapse. But suspicion isn't enough. I needed proof. And I began to understand this wasn't only about $12 million. It was about who had crossed lines my family once believed could never be crossed. The next morning I said to Dana, "We're going back to the farm." She looked at me. Her eyes weren't only grieving anymore. There was something else there. Readiness. "Not to beg," I added. Dana gave a small nod. This time, I knew I was walking into a confrontation where innocence had no place left. 3 days later, I heard Hazel was hosting a party at the farm, an investor gathering according to her social media post. There was a photo of my wooden house, the red maple trees blazing behind it, and a caption that read, "Opportunity to own a legacy property in Vermont." I stared at that picture for a long time. Grant grew up on that lawn. I planted every row of those apple trees, and now they were a backdrop for a transaction. Grant's old colleague had prepared an emergency filing to challenge the beneficiary change. The investigator forwarded everything about Jackson to state police. I didn't argue. I didn't make speeches. I just signed what needed signing. The USB was duplicated. The recordings were authenticated. That evening, Dana wore the gray coat she had on the day of Grant's graduation. No makeup. She didn't need any. "Are you sure?" she asked, as we parked a few hundred yards from the gate. "I'm not sure what will happen," I said, "but I'm sure we can't stay silent." The farm was lit up like a resort. Luxury cars lined the drive. Music drifted from the open windows. I walked through the gate I once never needed permission to enter. Hazel stood in the yard holding a glass of wine, speaking to a group of well-dressed investors. Jackson lingered nearby, smiling lightly, stepping in with a few polished remarks. When Dana and I crossed into the open space, several guests turned. Hazel saw us almost immediately. The smile on her lips stiffened. "What are you doing here?" she asked, low enough so the guests wouldn't hear. "I came to hear how you describe the value of this land," I said. "I'm curious whether you're selling memories too, or just acreage." Jackson stepped forward slightly in front of her. "This is a private event," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's why I brought my own guests." I didn't have to turn around. 2 state police cars had just stopped at the gate, behind them an unmarked federal vehicle. Grant's old colleague stepped out with a trust attorney. The music inside continued for a few seconds, until someone noticed the shift and turned it off. Guests began drifting backward in small clusters. Hazel looked at me, then at the patrol cars. For the first time, I saw real confusion in her eyes. "Todd, what are you doing?" she asked. "I'm finishing what my son started," I said. The attorney stepped forward and calmly explained there was reasonable cause to review the validity of the beneficiary change. Electronic filing discrepancies, device inconsistencies, financial transfers connected to Jackson. Hazel shook her head. "Grant signed everything. It's legal." I took the USB from my coat pocket. "Grant also recorded conversations," I said. I didn't play it aloud in the yard. The attorney had already reviewed it, but the mention alone shifted the air. I saw Jackson's expression change. A state trooper approached him. "Mr. Jackson Reed," the officer asked. Jackson didn't answer right away. The private investigator I'd spoken with stepped forward, presenting copies of prior warrants and related case files. Jackson looked at Hazel, as if waiting for her to steady the story. Hazel took a step back. I didn't know about any of that, she said quickly. He told me everything was fine. I didn't interrupt. I just stood there, watching the perfect arrangement she believed in begin to fracture. Our attorney opened another document. There is an addendum within the trust, he said, a misconduct clause. If the beneficiary engages in abuse toward the grantor's parents or is connected to actions causing harm to the grantor, the assets automatically transfer into a charitable trust administered by Mr. Todd. Hazel turned to me. You can't do that, she said, her voice lower now. I didn't, I replied. Grant did. Silence spread across the yard. Another officer approached Hazel, requesting her cooperation regarding the insurance filing and recent financial transfers. Jackson tried stepping back toward the gate. He was stopped. I didn't feel triumph, only a circle closing. Dana stood beside me, her hand lightly touching mine. Not to restrain me, just to remind me we were still standing. Guests began leaving quietly. No one cared about investment opportunities anymore. Hazel was escorted toward a patrol car for further questioning. Before getting in, she turned to look at the house. There was no ambition left in her face, only something hollow. Jackson said something to an officer, but no one seemed to listen. As the police vehicles pulled away, their headlights swept once more across the apple rows. I stood in the yard that hours earlier had been staged for celebration. Now there was only wind and dry leaves shifting across the ground. The attorney walked over to me. The process will take time, he said, but the contingency clause is active. The assets are frozen pending investigation. I nodded. Dana looked up at Grant's old bedroom window. The curtain was still half drawn, just as it had been the day we left. Todd, she whispered. He saw it coming. I know, I said. That night we didn't sleep in the van. We stayed in the wooden house, not as people thrown out, but as people asked to remain until the truth settled. I sat at the kitchen table, where Hazel once laid those papers in front of me. Now the only thing on the table was Grant's USB. I didn't open another file. I had heard enough to understand. This justice doesn't arrive with noise. It comes through small details, prepared in advance, and my son, even though he wasn't here anymore, had left us a path forward. The next morning, sunlight came through the kitchen window, as if nothing had ever happened. I made coffee, listened to the familiar sound of water boiling. Dana sat across from me, both hands wrapped around her warm cup. The house was still the same house, but the air felt different. No strange footsteps on the wooden floor. No eyes measuring every corner of the walls. The legal process stretched over several weeks. The beneficiary change was suspended pending investigation. Financial transactions connected to Jackson were reviewed. Grant's contingency clause officially took effect once authorities confirmed signs of fraud in the filings. I didn't follow every step of what happened to Hazel after that. I only know she faced the legal consequences of her choices. And Jackson, from what I was told, was no longer moving around as freely as before. I wasn't celebrating, I just felt a necessary quiet return. One afternoon, the attorney brought the final document. It confirmed that the full insurance payout and the trust funds would transfer into a new structure, exactly as Grant had drafted. I was appointed temporary administrator. Todd, the attorney, said, "You're permitted to use these funds for personal purposes if you choose." No one would object. I looked out at the apple orchard. I've lived long enough to understand. Money doesn't repair what's broken. It only gives you the chance to decide how to respond. That evening I said to Dana, I don't want to keep this money for ourselves. She wasn't surprised. She only asked, "What are you thinking?" I reopened Grant's draft. At the bottom there was a short handwritten note. If there's ever a chance, help those who have no one standing beside them. I read that line several times. And that's how Grant's Sanctuary began. Not a large building overnight. Just a modest program at first, partnering with a local organization to provide legal guidance and temporary housing for elderly people, abandoned or financially exploited by their families. I didn't go to the press. I didn't want my name attached to it. I wanted Grant's name remembered differently. In the months that followed, Dana and I spent more time in town. We met people whose stories reminded me we weren't alone. Some had lost access to their own bank accounts. Some had been pressured into signing papers they didn't understand. Each time, I thought about that small silver USB drive and the orchard. One early spring afternoon, when new buds began forming, Dana and I stood beneath the oldest apple tree. "Are you sure?" she asked. "Just like the night of the party." "I'm sure," I said. We completed the paperwork to donate most of the farm to the town, to become a community park. My only condition was that the central orchard remain intact and carry Grant's name. There was no large stage on announcement day, just a few families from town, a handful of children running across the grass I used to mow every week. I watched them climb the lower branches, laughing when ripe apples dropped into their hands. Dana sat on a new wooden bench beneath the trees. Her eyes softened in a way I hadn't seen for months. "Todd," she said quietly, "I think Grant would like this." "I think so too," I answered. I don't know whether Hazel ever heard about the park or the foundation. I didn't send her a letter. I didn't need her to witness it. For me, justice isn't watching someone fall. Justice is knowing the wrong was exposed, and the right was given room to stand. One late spring afternoon, I sat alone beneath the oldest apple tree. A gentle wind moved through the new leaves. I remembered that phone call. "You have 24 hours. I thought everything ended there. But it turned out that was only the beginning of another journey. I lost a son. That will never change. But I didn't lose the values Dana and I raised him with. In fact, those values guided us when everything else collapsed. Money can buy temporary control, but kindness, preparation, and integrity, those are what endure. As the sun set behind the maple trees, I heard children calling to each other to head home. I stood up and brushed off my hands. This farm no longer belongs only to me, but for the first time in many months, I felt exactly where I was meant to be. If you've stayed with me to these final moments, please subscribe to the channel, press like, and share so others can listen too. Life tests us without warning, but even in loss, even in betrayal, we still have the right to choose how we rise, not with bitterness, but with clarity and kindness. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Your listening means more than you know.